a discussion of Gnosticism and its relationship to the to mysticism. Now, I don't think we've discussed Gnosticism before. Is that right? Did we talk about it? Yeah, we mentioned it, but didn't go into detail. Okay, Gnosis is a Greek word for knowledge, and it's in its most basic sense, it simply means you know something, just like we know you know your friend, or you know a topic, or you know a city, or anything like that. Within mystical circles and esoteric circles, it came to take on a technical meaning of special spiritual knowledge. And it's often associated with Sophia. Sophia is Greek for wisdom. So if you have Sophia, it gives you gnosis. You have wisdom, and wisdom here is personified. It's not like you have lots of experience, so you're wise. It is, divine wisdom infuses in you and gives you knowledge. Okay? Now, both of those technical terms become key terms in Jewish mysticism, with knowledge as da'at and wisdom as chokmah. And those two things are two of the 10 sephirot in the Jewish mystical system. Does that make sense to everybody? And they also pop up in Islamic thought as well. But what we're looking at here is what is translated here, which I think is a pretty good translation: esoteric knowledge of divine mysteries reserved for a spiritual elite. So it is not ordinary knowledge, but esoteric knowledge. It is of divine things, and usually mysteries, that is, things that the ordinary people don't know, and it is known by a spiritual elite. And that makes a guy a Gnostic. Gnostikos, is one who knows. Now, the question is, what is the nature of this knowledge? What is it that the person knows? And I've listed here kind of a sequence of, the idea. First of all, it's just a person who knows stuff. Then it's a person who knows God, gains salvation by knowing God, gains it through secret revelation, and so on. So, it's kind of a sequence of concepts that are kind of tacked on to the idea of gnosis. Now, here's another key term, a key idea, is that there was never a religion called Gnosticism. Scholars have created a modern scholarly construct that we call Gnosticism, which is a useful concept, but we need to understand it's not a religion. It is an esoteric aspect of religion. It is like mysticism is not a religion. It is a feature or characteristic of religions. Gnosticism overlaps with mysticism, but it's got its own unique ideas. Okay? Now, So there are Gnostic elements in lots of different religions, including Christianity. When Christianity says, this is eternal life, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent, that's a Gnostic idea, right? Eternal life is to know God and to know Jesus. So it's not a religion, it is a characteristic of religions. Now, when we talk about Gnosticism as a movement of late Hellenistic times, we're talking about a Christian Gnosticism, and they're related to these Nag Hammadi texts we'll talk about in just a second. This Christian Gnosticism features with a kind of an overlap and a syncretism of Hellenistic, Neoplatonic or Platonic philosophy, Hermetic lore, and Christian theology. And they mix and merge these together to create what are called Christian Gnostics, Christian Gnosticism. Now, here's some of the characteristics of this movement. It's associated with Neoplatonic ideas. That is, it overlaps with them. The Neoplatonists, in fact, the technical Neoplatonists don't like the Gnostics. They think they're wrong, but they share a bunch of ideas. They talk about a thing called the pleroma, which means the fullness, and it's kind of the divine realm. There is a mind-matter or soul-matter dualism that we find in lots of forms of mysticism. But in Gnosticism, or at least this Christian Gnosticism we're talking about, flourishes from about 100 to 300 or 400 AD. The matter is evil, okay? Spirit's mind is good. That's the only good thing. Matter is evil. Now, the biblical worldview, when God creates the world, he says he did this and did that, and then he said it is good. God saw that it was good. That is the idea that the created order is good. Gnostics deny that, okay? And even though they are Christian and Jewish Gnostics, the way they deny that is say that the world was created by a mediator figure or a kind of a, anyway, they call him the demiurge, whom we met in Hermetic lore, right? Okay, there is esoteric knowledge that the soul needs to understand its true nature. So the goal of this knowledge is to understand the true nature of the universe, the true nature of God, the true nature of yourself. When you understand the true nature of those things, you're saved. And being saved is an act of enlightenment. It is knowing, it is changing your knowledge base. And basically, the idea here is that the real world, the material world that we see around us is not what it seems. It's almost an illusion. I mean, it exists in reality, but it is a deception. It fools us. And so you've got to get this spiritual knowledge to understand what's really going on. Once you do, you can be liberated. Okay? Now, it is a movement filled with mysteries, revelations, ascents, and mysticism of sorts, and lots of secrecy and lots of rituals. Okay? So there's lots of things going on behind the scene in this. Okay, any questions on this? Now, there were pagan Gnostics, there were Jewish Gnostics, and there are Christian Gnostics. The Nag Hammadi texts, which we'll be discussing in just a second, are Christian Gnostic texts. And so we're looking at Christian mysticism, and so we're talking about the Gnostics because of their relationship and influence to Christian mysticism. I should emphasize that none of the standard Christian mystics were Gnostics in the technical sense, but they shared kind of a worldview a little bit. Not in the details, but in the broad characteristics. Now, I've listed here a number of Gnostic Christian sects. There's a whole bunch of these. Okay, they were a fractious movement where everybody got their own revelation, and so everybody came up with a different idea. You know what I'm saying? And they had disciples and followers, but they didn't have a central authority, no central doctrine, kind of a bunch of shared ideas which end up coming into all sorts of different phenomenon. Okay, here's some secondary sources on Gnosticism. If you want to pursue it, you can take a look at some of these and they'll just talk about the different details and so forth. In terms of the primary sources, there's the Nag Hammadi library. We'll explain that in a second. And there's two translations, the Latin Gnostic scriptures and the Meyer Nag Hammadi scriptures. Okay? Then there's the Pistis Sophia, which is a wisdom allegory, and the Book of Jehu, which is a ascent allegory, and then the Forster book, Gnosis, is a collection of non-Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts, largely from Christian writers and others who are talking about what the Gnostics believe rather than from the Gnostics themselves. Like an anti-Gnostic Christian might quote a Gnostic thing. And then, so it is kind of the other sources surrounding this. Most important of the Nag Hammadi library. Now let me explain what that is. Have you guys heard of this before, or do I need to explain it? You vaguely heard of it, but you want an explanation? Okay. Nag Hammadi is a place in Egypt. If this is the Nile Delta here, the Nile comes down like this. Nag Hammadi's, somewhere in central South Egypt. It was the location of a monastery. There were lots of monasteries in Christian or in Christian Egypt. We're talking now the 4th century AD, late 4th century. Monasticism has spread, and the monks are kind of esotericists, and they collect a library of books that included the Bible and, letters of so-and-so and the works of Athanasius, the life of St. Anthony. I mean, all sorts of just standard Christian texts. But they also collect a bunch of these Gnostic texts, which were considered heretical. They just have them in the library. We don't know if these monks believed them or why they were there, but they just collect books. Okay, it's just like I have books on Hinduism and I have books on Buddhism. And that doesn't make me a Buddhist or Hindu just because I have a book on the subject. So we don't know what the monks who collected these were. But we do know that, well, what we assume is that in the late 4th century, as the heresy hunters were running around, they started saying anybody who has these books is a heretic and, will be punished. And so the monks who had these books put them in jars and sealed them up and buried them so that they wouldn't be found with the books. They didn't want to destroy them because they thought they were cool, but they couldn't have them in the library. So they buried them somewhere. And then, whatever happened, the guys forgot about it, and they never got picked up again. So this is Dead Sea Scroll stuff all over again, right? It's a different version of the Dead Sea Scroll story. These texts were buried sometime in the late 4th century, near the village of Nag Hammadi. That's why they're called the Nag Hammadi texts, because they were found at this village of Nag Hammadi, but that's the modern name of the village. We assume it's from some monastery in that area. Now, it's possible there isn't even from a monastery. It's possible it's somebody's private library, but they're kind of, the fact that they buried them indicates that there was some pressure to not have those books, and if it was a private individual, he could just have the books hidden, right? So it kind of implies that there's some official connection there, but these things are debated. Anyway, okay, so then these things were dug up. Some peasant was out digging up some soil to, farm his land and fertilize stuff, and he hits these jars, and they start selling them on the black market and track them down and manage to collect most of them, and then eventually translate them into English, and scholars have been studying them ever since. What this library contains is a whole bunch of books whose shared theme is that they all have a Gnostic worldview. Now, most of them are Christian books. They're Christian-oriented. They talk about Jesus, and Jesus is like a Gnostic mystical revelator, okay? Some of them have nothing to do with Christianity. There's a Manichaean one. There's a Hermetic text like that Corpus Hermeticum. One of the texts in there is from that. So there's a number of texts that aren't Christian, and you can't look at these texts and say, this is all the text of one religion. There were lots of different movements reflected in these books, and lots of different beliefs and ideas. The only thing that seems to be shared is they were considered heretical by the imperial church at that time, and so they buried them. They probably were supposed to destroy them, but somebody preferred to save them and bury them and hopefully read them later, and then they just got lost. Okay? Now, what do they contain? They contain basically the texts about ascent, apocalypses, allegories, ritual texts, some magical texts, some, just all sorts of stuff. And some of it's very strange. They talk about things like the Ogdoad. I think I have that listed up there. That's the 8th level of heaven and so forth. And the mysteries of the Ogdoad, that's, just one of the things they like to talk about. They talk about, there's other sayings books, like the Gospel of Thomas is the most famous of these. It's just a gospel. It says, this is the Gospel of Thomas, and then it just launches off. And it's just a bunch of sayings of Jesus. And about half or 2/3 are found in the New Testament, and the rest are not. So people debated endlessly, what's the relationship of this book to the New Testament? Is it come after the New Testament, or is it before the New Testament, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these books physically date to the 4th century. They are all in Coptic. What is Coptic? It's the Egyptian language, late antique Egyptian language written in the Greek alphabet. with some additional characters added for Coptic sounds. So it's Pharaonic Egyptian, but written in Greek, and it is the language of Greek Christians, or excuse me, Egyptian Christians. Most people assume, and there's lots of reasons to assume this, that there was a Greek original behind this. That these texts, most of them were written maybe in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Most of them were written in Greek. And some of them are, in fact, translations from Aramaic into Greek, but the monks, or whoever had these books, whoever translated them, rather, translated them from Greek into Coptic so that the ordinary Egyptians could read them. Okay? Now, these books contain lots of ideas that are, mystically oriented, that overlap with mystical beliefs and practices of the medieval Christian mystics. They also contain a lot of things that overlap with the Jewish mystics. For example, the book of Jehu talks about seals that you need to pass the guardian angels. That's straight out of some of those ascent texts of the Enoch ascent texts of the Jews, right? The Merkabah stuff. Got to have a seal. And they show the seals. They're little, designs, geometric designs with dots and stuff on them. So there is a nexus in which these things are overlapping and they branch off into different traditions. So there's a bunch of shared stuff and a bunch of unique stuff. And as I said, some of them are purely Christian and don't seem to be very Gnostic at all. Some of them are Christian and very Gnostic. Some of them are Gnostic but not Christian at all. I mean, it's just a hodgepodge. Okay? Now, there are movements called neo-Gnostic movements you should just be aware of, which are kind of a New Age movement, New Age type of mysticism that is linked to these texts. They're essentially, the neo-pagan and New Age movements are essentially religious revivals of old dead religions that were studied by scholars. They wrote popular books on the subject. The people read the books and said, this is the religion I believe in, and then kind of started the religion again. So you got witchcraft, Wicca, Egyptian paganism, all sorts of stuff in this. So the neo-Gnostics, and I just put the term neo in front of these. So there's neo-Egyptian movements, there's neo-Greek paganism. I mean, there's all sorts of versions. The neo-Gnostics are people who take these Gnostic texts and say, this is our religion, and they create then a kind of New Age version of this old Gnosticism. So just be aware those guys are around. I've listened. If you want to know what they think, here's a couple books about these from that perspective. The ones up here are scholarly books about Gnosticism in its ancient forms. Okay, and basically the technical side of Gnosticism, the unique side of it dies out in the 4th and 5th centuries because the imperial church essentially begins to enforce orthodoxy, and so these heretical movements either pop up outside the Roman Empire or disappear, but they're not permitted to continue within the Roman Empire. So you basically, up through the 5th century, you get the enforcement of orthodoxy by the imperial church and the disappearance of some of these heretical movements within Christianity. Heretical from the perspective of the imperial church, right? So does that make sense to people? So we will be discussing on and off some Gnostic-related ideas. And if you want to read the Gnostic texts, those are the two best books to go with. The second one is actually, I think, better in the 2nd edition, because the 3rd edition, they decided to follow kind of popular political correctness, and they changed all the God stuff to neutral language and so forth, which, I mean, maybe that's a politically correct thing to do, but it ruins the historical nature of the text, because you don't know if, this is a male or female in the verb form, and, so it kind of screws it up a little bit, but I don't know why they did that. Somebody pressured them or thought it was the way to go. Okay, questions on that? The next thing we need to look at then is the rise of Mary. Now what I'm doing is kind of giving you some general background on the phenomenon that are going on during the rise of Christian mysticism. The rise of Mary is much more significant for medieval mysticism than is the Gnostic stuff. The Gnostics do survive, I forgot to mention, as kind of quasi-heretical movements among the Bogomils in Bulgaria and the Cathars in southern France. But they are they're quite different than the archaic Gnosticism. But there are kind of dualistic elements that survive in some later Christian heresies as well. Okay, Mary is, this is the official Latin theology, official doctrine about Mary. She is the eternal, the woman who has the Immaculate Conception. She was conceived immaculately. She's always a virgin. When she finished her mortal life, she was bodily and in body and soul assumed into heaven, into celestial glory. Okay? So, what that is Immaculate Conception. What does that mean? It means she was conceived without original sin. So, the idea was, if Mary had original sin, then she couldn't give birth to the sinless Son of God. So she must have had no original sin, therefore she was conceived without original sin. So miraculous birth, in other words. She is always virgin, eternally virgin. That is, she never had any sex at all ever, and never had any other kids. Okay? When she finished her mortal life, she was bodily and in body and soul assumed into celestial glory. So this is the bodily ascension of Mary, and that she now is enthroned in heaven and crowned by Jesus and enthroned in heaven and is basically a exalted, godlike being. Now they don't call her a god, but in practical terms, she's godlike. Okay? Now, we need to understand two things. Number one is the importance of Mary as a figure in medieval mysticism. She's a crucial figure in lots of different ways. She plays all sorts of intermediary roles. She is a figure of contemplation and all sorts of other things. So bear that in mind. The second is, how did this develop historically? Now, in the first century, and what I've done is just list kind of the developments and ideas about Mary. First century, she plays an important role in the New Testament as the mother of Jesus, and it talks about her virgin birth of Jesus, right? The virgin, actually it's virgin conception, technically speaking, right? It doesn't mention any of the other stuff, but those two things are straightforward. In the second century, you begin to see Mary metaphorically compared with Eve. If Jesus is the second Adam, then Mary is the second Eve. And just as Jesus overcomes the sins of Adam, Mary overcomes the sins of Eve. Okay? So this is an allegorical interpretation of her role. Nothing, celestial about this, but it's her, things they're saying about her. Then by the 4th century, they're talking about perpetual virginity. It's ai parthenos, forever virgin. And basically the idea there is related to the concept that sexuality is inherently sinful and takes you away from the spiritual life, and that's a monastic concept. But also the idea that original sin is passed to children through the sex act. So there's a connection of that. And so everyone's born with original sin. But that means, Mary can't have given birth to Jesus, or she would have transmitted the original sin to Jesus. And then he couldn't have overcome the sin and had the atonement. So she must not have had it. So therefore she must have had a miraculous birth. So notice, they're essentially creating about Mary a parallel track of the miracles and great things Jesus did. Mary's got the same thing. So Jesus got a miraculous birth, so does Mary. Jesus bodily ascends into heaven after the resurrection, so does Mary. Jesus sits crowned in eternal glory with the Father, so does Mary. Do you see what I mean? So they're just creating a parallel track of Mary. So what you're getting then is the development of a female quasi-divinity that can be the great focus of both male and female mystics. So there's a lot of Mary-related mysticism going on in the medieval world. Now in 431, they declared Mary Theotokos, which means the mother of God, or actually is more like the bearer of God, the person who bore God, that gave birth to God. Okay, so the idea here is that she is not just the mother of Jesus' human nature, but of his divine nature. This is related to Monophysite and Diophysite theologies that were running around at this time. So she's the mother of the godlike part of Christ. Now, this was rejected by the Nestorians. All of these things kind of created schisms, but at any rate, you've got that added on. So she's increasingly, it's increasing her status and her divine and miraculous nature by all of these pronouncements. Okay, in the 6th century, then, you've got the corporeal assumption of Mary. So she dies, she's buried in the tomb, but then it's not quite resurrection, but her body ascends into heaven. So this is another key thing that she has. They don't call it a resurrection, but she ascends into heaven just like Jesus does. Okay? So you get that by the 6th century. All right. What this turns into then in medieval mysticism is the adoration of Mary. She is considered to be the greatest among the saints. You can pray to Mary to intervene with Christ and God. So you may feel too sinful to pray directly to God, but you can pray to Mary. And it's kind of psychologically the difference between going to your father and going to your mother. The father figure is the stern lawgiver, and the mother figure is the nurturer and protector. So, whether that's psychologically true or not, that's kind of what's going on here. And so Mary becomes the intermediary. She's inferior to the Son, but superior to everybody else. Okay, so she is the greatest of the saints, and she's greater than the angels. Now, what this means is women often would pray to Mary rather than to Jesus or God. But it's interesting that a lot of the female mystics focus their mystical attention on Jesus as a male figure, not on Mary, and vice versa. A lot of male mystics focus their mystical attention on Mary. So it's not that all the women like Mary and all the men like Jesus. I mean, it's not that way at all. It's a mixed bag. It'll go back and forth. And there's really no contradiction between mystical relation with Jesus or one with Mary. You can have them both, right? It's not like if you have the one, you can't have the other. What this turns into is Mariolatry, which means the veneration of Mary. Now, the Catholics create, Greek Orthodox too, create a careful distinction between worshiping Mary and venerating her. Venerating is honoring, worship is due only to God. But in practical terms, there's no difference, right? In terms of what goes on in a church, a person comes up to an icon of Mary, prays to it, leaves an offering of a flower or a ribbon or something, and attributes a miracle to Mary. There are Marian apparitions where the Virgin Mary appears to people. Lots of these all over the place. Okay, so it becomes an extremely significant mystical phenomenon with Mary. Okay. Another thing to note: there's lots of popular piety surrounding Mary, which is quasi-mystical. There's the Hail Mary prayer, there's the Rosary, which are the little beads that you flip through and you say prayers to Mary. The Angelus is another Mary hymn. There are lots of Mary sites, pilgrimage sites. The most famous in the New World is Guadalupe in Mexico. If you ever get a chance, you should go down there. It's pretty interesting to see what's going on. The Fatima is the Shrine of Fatima in Lourdes, I think, are in France. So there's lots of different shrines dedicated to Mary. And then lots of feast days. You see, all of these are feast days associated with Mary. Notice the coronation of Mary in heaven. This is that Mary, when she ascends into heaven, is seated on a throne beside Christ, and Christ crowns her in heaven. Now that's straight out of the book of Revelation, where the martyrs are given crowns and they're seated on thrones beside God. But that is, when you see pictures of medieval cathedrals, you'll often see Jesus seated here and Mary seated here, and Jesus reaching out and crowning her. I mean, she is right by him. There's no distinction. In other ones, you'll see Jesus or Mary seated on a throne with the infant Jesus on her lap, where Mary overshadows Jesus in that way because she's the mother of God. She's not the mother of just Jesus. Okay? So, as we go through some of this stuff, you should just bear in mind the popping up of Mary within the mystical text that we're talking about. Hopefully this gives you background so you can kind of grasp some of the Mary issues that might get raised. Any questions on that? Any comments? Issues? Okay, these books are, this is just some books on Mary. The ones with dots by them are where I'd start if you're interested. The one Queen Mother is essentially, Mary is, there's a figure called Queen of Heaven in the Old Testament, which is probably Asherah, the Canaanite goddess. And then there's a figure in chapter 12 of the book of Revelation, there is the woman in the wilderness who's crowned with 12 stars and gives birth. That's assumed to be Mary. And so she is then called the Queen of Heaven. So God is the King of Heaven. Mary, Christ is the king, she's the queen, that type of thing. So there's a big, there's kind of a feminist interpretations of Mary as a mother goddess type of figure, okay, as well. Any questions on that? So you will see lots of stuff about Mary within the context of these different mystical movements. Now, we need to turn to McGinn chapter 4, and all I'll do is highlight a couple things that you should focus on. Again, I think McGinn is much more clear-cut to the average Christian reader than was the Kabbalah stuff. And again, the Muslim stuff will also be more difficult for you because just questions of background and understanding strange ideas and terms and so forth. Okay. This one focuses on mystical solitude, silence, and stillness. Those are three different things. And the idea here is that the mystic must completely abandon the things of the world, and that can only be done by isolating yourself. And that the mystic can allow God in only if all other things are out of his mind. So you've got to just empty your mind of everything, be completely still. Silence is an aspect where you pray, but you pray silently. And that's an unusual idea in the ancient Near East, where all prayer was vocal. Even if you were alone and praying, you would pray vocally. The idea of praying without speaking is kind of a mystical development in that. So just be aware that these ideas, the idea being you abandon the world, isolate yourself, and clear your mind of everything so that God can emerge and fill the mind completely. Anything else that's in your mind is going to block out God's presence, whatever it might be. Okay? So that's kind of what McGinn is talking about, the inner practices. Now, outer practices would be fasting. And inner practice is this silence and stillness. And we will talk later about the Hesychast movement, where this becomes very formalized among some Greek mystical monks. Another thing you should note is the Philokalia. I've listed there the web page where it's available online. This is an anthology of, in English translation, there's 5 volumes in it. It's an anthology made by a Russian monk in Greek originally of all of the fathers and monks and stuff, and he selected out all the mystical stuff that he liked and put them there. So it's kind of like this book, only from the Greek Orthodox perspective and from a practicing mystical perspective. So it is a collection of just an anthology of mystical texts, of only Greek Orthodox, right? None of the, Augustine, Francis, none of those guys are in there, because this is purely Greek Orthodox collection. Do you know what the Jesus Prayer is? This gets going in around 600 AD as a form, basically a monastic chant. The idea is you have to pray always and you have to keep Jesus always in your mind. And so they came up with this little prayer. It's very short. It is, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. And they just repeat it over and over and over again. So this, you'll see this among Sufis as well, the idea of chanting, repetitious chanting, as a mechanism to induce some type of spiritual state or experience. So the Jesus Prayer is invented by these Greek Orthodox, but it passes, so it's more prevalent in Greek Orthodoxy, but it passes somewhat into Christianity as well, and it's used by people today. So it's kind of like the Hail Mary, only it's a Jesus Prayer. Now the Our Father is also important. Everybody knows what the Our Father is, right? Okay. There's this distinction that he talks about between hermetic and cenobitic. And notice, this is not hermetic as in Hermes, it is hermetic as in hermit. Okay, so hermetic monasticism is where you go out completely by yourself. You're a hermit. You're all on your own. You have no support group. Cenobitic means eating together, and it refers to communal mysticism, where they form groups. In practical terms, both mysticism or both monasticisms, existed side by side, and often the hermits would be attached to a communal group, and they'd be fed by them, and they'd come out and check on them and stuff. So that but they'd still live out in a cave all by themselves, but they'd be attached to a communal group. So the idea being, the communal group is where you're trained, and then if you get far enough along, you can go off on your own. This is sometimes called a lavra. This is just a Syriac term, I think, for, monastery. So you'll see that popping up. There's still a few hermits around today. When I was over at Jerusalem, I went down the Wadi Kelt, which is the wadi between Jerusalem and Jericho, and there's a Russian Orthodox and a Greek Orthodox monastery down there, and there are a couple hermit monks associated with that. Now the one guy, the Russian Orthodox monk, he has a little room where he goes up and stays. It's a cave, and he let me in there, and there was a bed and a book and an icon and stuff. But I mean, he was just a few feet from the monastery. He'd come down and work with the monastery all the time. The Greek Orthodox hermit lived in a cave above the monastery. So basically, this was a jagged canyon, and they built a monastery in the side of the canyon wall. And then up in the side of the cliff, there was a little cave, and this monk lived there, and there was a rope with a basket on it hanging down. And so I was over there, and I saw that, and I talked to the monks, and I said, what's going on up there? And they said, that's a hermit. If hermit lives up there. And I said, well, what's he like? He said, I don't know, I've never seen him. They'd never met the guy. He's just stayed in that cave. The only way they know he's alive is he keeps sending down the basket, and they'll put some food in and take it up. So, I mean, that type of thing was not uncommon in antiquity. It's, pretty rare nowadays, but that's a classic hermit monk. And I told you about Simeon the Stellite last time, right? He's another example of a hermit monk. Only he climbed up on a pillar to get away from everybody rather than going in a cave. But it was the same basic phenomenon. Okay. They talk about spiritual friendship in the text a bit. And this is basically the idea that you have a person who's so spiritually in tune with you that you have exactly the same, you just have some type of amazing rapport with that person. And usually it starts as a master-disciple thing, but ends up as being a relationship of equals. And you'll see this, as I said, beginning with master-disciples, but you'll see monks and nuns who have real kind of spiritual I mean, they're not lovers, but they're beyond friends. I mean, it's not a sexual thing. It's sometimes between a man and a woman. It can be between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, and so forth. The two most famous are John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila in Spain in the 16th century. They were the two most famous mystics of the age, and they wrote each other all sorts of letters about mysticism stuff. And the other is Francis and Clare. St. Francis of Assisi, and his disciple Clare eventually becomes the head of her own monastic movement of the Clares, who are the female Franciscans. But they had that same type of relationship. Okay? This is sometimes reflected in these letters. I told you about letters as a genre of mystical literature. Essentially, these are letters generally between a master and a disciple. And they were meant to be private. They were never meant to be published. But these letters, are very precious to the disciple. They preserve those letters. And then eventually they'll get, sometimes they'll just be stuck in a monastery and somebody will discover them hundreds of years later. Or other times they might get published, either within the lifetime or after. But they are intended not as public letters, but private letters. And they're very interesting as a source for mysticism because you kind of get what you would have found if you could listen to the oral teachings of these guys, you find in the letters, right? We need to understand, in this medieval culture was fundamentally an oral culture. And most of what went on in mystical circles was oral, just like Isaac Luria and his disciples. It was a personal thing. You knew the guy, you lived with the mystic, and he taught you all the time, and there was this really personal bond and oral teaching going on. All of that's lost. All we can recover is the written text. So these letters are often a very important source of knowledge of mystical lore because they're so private. Now there's also letters, public letters, that were essentially open letters that were passed around as well. So that can be another source, but the private ones are interesting in that way. This guy, Miguel de Molinos, is he's one of the early, well, he's a late guy. I mean, this is very late mysticism from my perspective. But he gives an example of the mystic as heretic. That is to say, the mystic has a direct connection with God. Because of that, they claim a certain level of authority for their beliefs, teachings, and practices. This is what God told me to do. So they don't need to go through the church hierarchy, and usually this means either the Orthodox or Catholic church hierarchies. Some of the things they do are viewed as heretical, like the Gnostics were viewed as heretical, right? And so you get some tension developing sometimes, not all the time by any means, but a lot of the monastic or the mystical movements begin with guys considered heretics. Master Eckhart was considered a heretic. Francis was at least considered a rabble-rouser. The popes were worried about him, had some investigations of him. And same thing with this Miguel. And basically, so just be aware of that phenomenon. These guys are sometimes what you would call countercultural. Now, sometimes they're actually very much in tune with the local culture, like Bernard of Clairvaux was the abbot of a monastery and was the advisor to kings and popes. I mean, he was a worldwide figure. Other times, they're pretty, they undermine the Catholic authority. Okay? Anyway, he is part of what's called the Quietist controversy. The other one was that woman, what's her name? Madame Guyon. We read from her another reading, but she's another of the Quietists. What's Quietism? Oh, it's right there.
Just being like submissive and just not being what they were.
The idea here, we talked about the idea of solitude, stillness, and silence as a mystic ideal. The purpose being to open yourself up to the divine presence. The difference between that and quietism is fairly marginal and sometimes is just of emphasis. But the idea here is that they are excessively resigned, and passive. So it's almost like they become Buddhist monks who completely renounce the world. The other thing is these quietists talk about self-annihilation. That is, they no longer exist, whereas, you know, the official Catholic doctrine is resurrection. So the continuance of the soul is an independent ontological entity. So there's that potential problem. And these are not radical differences. This is a continuum. And, you know, the one monk's here, another monk's there, and the quietists are over here. And so the question is, you know, what's the legitimate level of quietism versus the illegitimate level? And, you know, there's all sorts of social factors going on behind this as well. The other thing that they objected to with the quietists is that they would sometimes say you should worship God without any hope of salvation or resurrection or anything. You just worship him because that's what you should do. And so that it's the abandonment of the belief that you gain any kind of eternal or material benefit from this. So there were different kind of issues that they got worried about. And some of this is, you know, angels on the head of a pin type of stuff. I think we've talked about the threefold way. What's the idea of an itinerary? What does that mean? What's that?
Like the progression, like the levels of progression on the way to God.
Right. It's essentially derives from pilgrimage. Pilgrimages, you go from one place to another, and they'd have stopping points along the way, where they'd have little shrines or a hostel where you could stay or whatever. And so the itinerary was, when you come to this church, you say this prayer, you meet this monk, then you go to the next church, you look at this image, you say the hymns there, you have mass there, whatever. There's kind of a set order that you do these pilgrimages. And this gets transformed into mystical pilgrimage, that is the journey of the soul back to God. And they came up with a series of ideas about itineraries, that is first you do this, then you do this, then you do this, then you'll arrive at God. So you see this in various forms, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, but, you know, different stages that you pass through. It's also found in Islamic mysticism. They're called the maqam or the maqamat, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. I think we talked about the 3 stages, right? Purgation, illumination, and perfection or union. So that is a almost universal thing in Christian mysticism, and you'll see similar patterns in Oriental mysticism in Islam and Judaism as well. Okay? This is a nice summary by Bonaventure, which comes from the book. These little things are pages from the book, right? So he just talks about the threefold way. That's what he's discussing. There's some stuff from Dionysius, and we'll discuss him later, because he's an important figure that needs to understand his impact. All right? What's imitation of Christ? That the mystic's goal is to imitate Christ in everything. That would be his moral teachings, his lifestyle, his wandering in the wilderness, but also to imitate Christ so there's a moral element, an ethical element, a spiritual, and then a unitive, which means you become one with Christ, and then even a physiological, where you experience the passion of Christ personally. So that's kind of the far radical end of the imitation of Christ. But by imitating Christ, you become Christ-like and therefore more open to union with God and union with Christ. And I've listed this passage from the Book of Mormon, which is, you know, the mystics would agree with that. Yeah, you got to be just like Christ. Now, part of this entailed experiencing the passion. What's the passion?
Basically atonement.
Yeah, it's the experiences of Christ's last few days of his, the Garden of Gethsemane, his beating by he's tortured by the Romans, crucified, all that type of stuff. You are so closely identified with Jesus that you experience the torments of Christ in the Passion. And notice, this derives from Paul, I am fixed on the cross with Christ. And Paul talks about having the marks of Christ in him. And that's where the stigmata in Greek, that's where the idea of, experiencing the crucifixion with Jesus and getting the stigmata from that experience, which is what Francis had. Okay, we need to talk about the difference between meditation and contemplation, then we'll move on to the next topic. But we'll do that next time. So.